Everybody, take a look at our lesson here. The struggle continues. Objectives and standards explain how people in the civil rights movement continue to work for equality and to analyze different struggles the civil rights movement faced. And our desired result, how the civil rights movement worked for equal rights. So 2 vocab words here. The Freedom Summer, the time frame when students sought to register African Americans to vote in the South. And Freedom Riders were supporters of the African American civil rights movement who rode buses across the South in hopes that the federal government would enforce a new policy of desegregation. Sorry, my apologies there. Should say desegregation if violence occurred. So buses. In 1961, both African American and other white supporters of the civil rights movement decided to travel to the South to test the ban on segregated facilities, especially on seating on buses and at facilities. They become known as the Freedom Riders. You can see examples of them here with some posters and signs and things like that. So they hope to provoke violence through their actions, so the federal government would take action to enforce a ban. Excuse me. So it does work, unfortunately. At Alabama state line, one bus was attacked by white supremacists with chains, brass knuckles, and pistols. Even though bloodied and beaten, the bus passengers did continue on. At a bus terminal in Birmingham, Alabama, the Freedom Riders were again beaten, and the passenger on the bus could not travel anymore, but another bus will continue on. So forward. About 200 angry white people attacked the second bus in Anniston, Alabama. The mob then followed the bus out of town. Don't mean to laugh, it's just crazy. And when the bus blew a tire, the mob actually broke windows on the bus and threw a firebomb into it. You can kind of see the pictures of it here, and a man sitting on the grass there. And passengers were able to escape just before the bus exploded. Now, resistance. The bus companies are going to refuse to carry any of the Freedom passengers any further, but a new batch of Freedom Riders were ready to carry on. In Birmingham, Alabama, police officers pulled the Freedom Riders off the bus, beat them, and then drove them to Tennessee, but the Freedom Riders returned to the bus terminal in resistance to this. So federal forces. The bus driver feared for his safety and refused to transport them, and the riders remained in the whites-only waiting room for 18 hours until finally, Attorney General Robert Kennedy grew so furious at this, he was able to convince the bus company to tell the driver he needed to continue. Now the passengers will arrive in Montgomery, Alabama finally. But despite agreement by officials in Alabama that the passengers would be safe, a mob attacked group members. Images of the violence soon shocked the nation as well as around the globe, and President Kennedy will order federal marshals to protect the Freedom Riders on the remainder of their journey to Jackson, Mississippi. Segregation will also be banned by the Attorney General and the Interstate Commerce Commission, and this will also apply to travel facilities such as waiting rooms, restrooms, and lunch counters. So university. In September of 1962, Air Force veteran James Meredith won a federal court case. The federal court case said that he would be allowed to enroll in the University of Mississippi, also known as Ole Miss. Now, it's not going to be easy for him, though, to enroll at this all-white school. In fact, when he arrived to register, Governor Ross Barnett refused to allow him to enroll in classes. President Kennedy will order federal marshals to escort James Meredith to the office of the registrar where he would sign up for classes. Governor Barnett actually issued a call on the radio to citizens, and thousands of white protesters showed up to try to prevent this African-American man from registering at the university. On September 30th, 1962, in the night, riots broke out that resulted in many arrests as well as the deaths of 2 people. Kennedy then pretty much tells Barnett to basically back down, and within months, Federal officials will guard Meredith on his way to class, and also his parents. In Birmingham, Alabama, there was still trouble, though. The city had a strict enforcement of segregation, along with racial violence, and Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth will invite Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to help. Now, following some small demonstrations, Dr. King Jr. and some others will actually be arrested during a demonstration. After posting bail to get out of jail, Dr. King Jr. planned to have more demonstrations, and over 1,000 children will demonstrate and march on May 2nd. This was known as the Children's March. And unfortunately, many of them were arrested by police under the control of Police Commissioner Eugene Bull, quote-unquote, Connor. On May 3rd, more children will decide to march, and they were actually attacked with attack dogs, fire hoses, and clubs. Now, what happens here is there's more protest, and the media is actually broadcasting this on television for people all over the country to see. Newspapers are taking pictures of these children being attacked by police officers and attack dogs and things like that. And there was also an economic boycott of the city. People refused to shop there or buy things there that's going to impact the city of Birmingham. So finally, the city will agree to end segregation. Now, this was a shocking victory for the civil rights movement, which inspired many African Americans across the country. It also made President Kennedy realize that a new Civil Rights Act would be required to solve any of this racial injustice. So, taking on civil rights. President Kennedy sent troops to force George C. Wallace, the governor of Alabama, to follow a court order for the University of Alabama to desegregate, again, to allow African Americans to enroll in the university. Kennedy actually addressed the nation about the issue of civil rights and demanded that Congress pass a civil rights bill. Sadly, hours later, Medgar Evers, the gentleman right here on the left, who was a World War II veteran and a NAACP field secretary, was murdered by a sniper, this man on the right. His name, he was a white supremacist by the name of Byron D. Beckwith. He was arrested for the murder, but he was later released after 2 of his trials resulted in hung juries, meaning that the jury couldn't come to a decision that he actually did it. He will later on in life be rearrested and tried for the murder of Medgar Evers, and he will be sentenced to jail for the rest of his life, and he will eventually die as a prisoner. But at this time, he won't face any penalties, really. But again, he will be arrested later on. Now, to help build support for a civil rights bill, a call went out for a march. And this occurred on August 28, 1963, and more than 250,000 people, including 75,000 whites, actually marched at the nation's capital. Now, participants marched from the Washington Monument to the Lincoln Memorial, and the crowd will erupt with applause for Dr. King Jr.'s speech, I Have a Dream speech, which you've probably heard before. Here's a picture of Dr. King giving his speech at the Lincoln Memorial, his I Have a Dream speech, which is one of the most well-known speeches in probably history now. But again, this was to call attention to civil rights and to call for a civil rights bill to be passed. Unfortunately, after Dr. King's famous words, 2 weeks later, more violence will occur. A driver in a car threw a bomb through a church window, and it killed 4 African-American little girls in Birmingham, Alabama. It's kind of hard to see this picture here, but there's pictures of the 4 girls here who were killed and some of their family, I assume, and then also scenes of the crime scene after the bomb was after the attack there at the church. 2 more were also killed as well in these 2 weeks in the times following Dr. King's speech. And also, President John F. Kennedy, as we've discussed, was assassinated in November of 1963, so about 3 months after Dr. King's speech. So this was a very, very, very violent time, and people were, still fighting for civil rights, and were very unsure where the civil rights movement was going to go following all this kind of tragedy and violence that was going on. Done.